The case featured in this episode has been researched using police records, court documents, witness statements, and the news. Listener discretion is advised. All parties mentioned are innocent until proven guilty, and all opinions are my own. Hey everyone, my name is Nikki Young, and this is Serial Napper, the true crime podcast for naps. I'm back with another true crime story to lull you to sleep, or perhaps to give you nightmares. Before dawnbreak on New Year's Day 1998, 21-year-old Ben Smart and 17-year-old Olivia Hope were looking for a place to crash after spending the evening celebrating with other partygoers in the Marlborough Sounds in New Zealand. They were last seen getting out of a water taxi and boarding a yacht after a strange man offered them a place to sleep off the champagne on board his boat. Not the greatest of decisions, but they really needed a place to sleep because other partygoers had already taken their place that they had originally booked. Ben and Olivia would never be seen again, and their bodies and belongings have never been found. What followed was a 5-month-long investigation into a man named Scott Watson, who the police believed was the strange man who had offered up his yacht. However, the investigation was rife with accusations of prejudice and police incompetence, while Scott Watson maintained his innocence. This was a case based solely on circumstantial evidence and statements given by jailhouse informants, highly controversial, particularly in a high-profile double murder case like this one. Yet it was enough to convict Scott and to sentence him to life behind bars, which he has spent the last 26 years fighting. So, dim the lights, put your phone down, and listen to the story of Scott Watson, who believes the case against him was a mistrial of justice, and he just finished his last bid for freedom, which was full of shocking accusations against the people who are supposed to protect us. So, let's jump right in. 21-year-old Ben Smart and 17-year-old Olivia Hope were great friends, though they previously were much more. The young couple had once dated. However, for New Year's Eve in 1997, they decided to celebrate as friends at Furneaux Lodge, located in the Endeavour Inlet of the Marlborough Sounds in New Zealand, a picturesque collection of valleys and islands overtaken by the seawater. The lodge itself was only accessible by boat, and they had booked bunks on a yacht where they could crash once the party was over. Ben was still trying to figure out what he wanted to do with his life, but in the meantime, he had decided to take on a job working for his father. Olivia had just graduated from high school, and she had plans to attend Otago University on a scholarship. The future looked bright. There was much to look forward to in the new year, and there was no better way to celebrate than at this big New Year's Eve bash, attended by more than 1,500 people. Even after the clock struck midnight, the party continued into the early morning hours. Everyone was having a great time, and the alcohol was flowing. It wasn't until around 4 a.m. when they decided that it was probably time to get some sleep. Ben and Olivia had bunks reserved on a chartered yacht called Tamarack, but they discovered that people had already taken their bunks, so they'd have to find somewhere else to sleep. They got on a water taxi that was passing by, taking guests back and forth between the lodge and the boats sitting in the bay. This water taxi was driven by a lodge bartender named Guy Wallace, and it had 3 other passengers on board, 2 women and a man who appeared to be by himself. This man offered Ben and Olivia a spot to sleep on his yacht, and reluctantly, they agreed. They didn't have much of a choice at this point, and there were 2 of them, so they kind of felt a sense of security going together. According to Wallace, he dropped Ben, Olivia, and this unknown man off at what he claimed to be his yacht before bringing the other 2 individuals to their own boat, and that is the last time Ben and Olivia were ever seen again. The following morning, the families of Ben and Olivia were shocked to find them both missing. They decided to take the day to ask around and check with some of their other friends who were also at the party to just find out where they were last seen. It was a huge party after all. Maybe Ben and Olivia were somewhere just sleeping off a hangover. On January 2nd, when there was still no sign of Ben or Olivia, their parents reported them as missing to the police. Their absence was treated as highly suspect because it was completely out of their character to just disappear and not communicate with their families. But it wasn't long before this missing persons search turned into a possible homicide investigation, codenamed Operation Tam, which was short for Tamarack, the name of the yacht that they had originally booked those bunks on. The police searched the water for their bodies or any sign of their possessions. The thought was maybe they had accidentally fallen overboard, but nothing was ever found. Investigators had a ton of people that they needed to speak to get statements from. There were over 1,500 guests at the party, so someone must have seen something that might help. One of the witnesses that they spoke to was Guy Wallace, the lodge employee who was driving the water taxi that evening, and they learned that Wallace was one of the last people to see the young couple alive. Police were also able to quickly identify the other two individuals who had been aboard the water taxi when Ben and Olivia hopped on, and they were able to clear them. They were not suspects in this case. But now they needed to identify the man, the one who appeared to be by himself and had offered Ben and Olivia a place to stay on his yacht. Wallace described this yacht as being a wooden, two-masted ketch, about 38 to 40 feet long, with a blue stripe running along the hull, which, this description, it was supported by the other witnesses on the water taxi that evening. As for the unknown man who claimed to own the yacht that Ben and Olivia would be staying on, he was described as being scruffy, with maybe 2 days of beard growth on his face. He was around 5'9" tall, with short dark wavy hair and possibly arm tattoos. He was wearing a Levi's shirt with jeans, and he had been seen at the party earlier in the evening sitting at the lounge bar. Investigators seem to hone in on one man in particular who they believe is that stranger who offered up his yacht to Ben and Olivia, a local man named Scott Watson, who had a pretty extensive criminal record. His crimes were mostly petty, and they were committed during his teen years. His record showed a history of theft, possession of cannabis, and an assault that had landed him in jail for a few years. But Scott had maintained that he had gotten his life together and he cleaned up his act. It had been 8 years since he was released from prison, and he said he had learned his lesson. He didn't want to commit crimes and he didn't want to go back to jail. Still, was this the reason that he was picked out so early on in the investigation? We can only speculate because he didn't seem to match any of the witness statements. Scott Watson did own a yacht that was parked in the Marlborough Sounds that evening, but it was a single-masted boat named Blade, not a two-masted ketch that had been described by both Wallace and another guest on the water taxi. And the Blade did not have that blue stripe that was noted on the other yacht. Multiple witnesses reported that they had seen that two-masted ketch anchored in the water that evening, but the police didn't seem to believe that such a boat was even there the night of the party. Later on, a retired officer who had been close to the case revealed that they were actually instructed to ignore any reported sightings of a two-masted ketch. They simply were not interested in finding this boat, and they kind of talked like it didn't even exist, that they didn't believe that this was a real yacht that was there. There was another problem. Scott was also clean cut, while the strange mystery man in the water taxi was described as scruffy. Scott was also much shorter than the stated height of the mystery man. Still, investigators believed that Scott Watson could be their man. They included his photo in a lineup that was shown to Wallace, and Wallace didn't pick out any of the men shown to him as the unidentified man in the water taxi. So investigators decide to change things up a bit. They show Wallace a different photo lineup, but this time they include a photo of Scott Watson where he has his eyes half closed, which made him appear as if he had droopy eyes. This photo would be forever known as the blink photo, a big point of contention because it wasn't an accurate depiction of how Scott Watson actually looked. This mystery man, this stranger that hadn't been identified, had been described as having these kind of droopy eyes. Scott Watson did not, but in this particular photo where his eyes were half closed, that's kind of the way it looked. In this photo lineup, Wallace says that the man in the blink photo looks like it could be the same man who was on the boat, but added that while the eyes were the same as the man he saw that night, the hair was definitely different. It was short and tidy, while the man who was in the water taxi had longer, shaggy hair. Still, this was enough for the police to get a warrant for Scott Watson's boat and his family homes. To many, it seemed like a wild goose chase. Those who knew Scott Watson and his family felt like investigators were trying to make the pieces fit when they just didn't. Officers on the case have been accused of surveilling Scott and his family without the appropriate permissions, including tapping the phone line in the Watson family home. They even utilized Scott Watson's girlfriend at the time to try to get information out of him, recording over 70 hours of phone conversations where Scott said absolutely nothing incriminating. Most shocking, there were even disgusting rumors that began to circulate around the community that implied that Scott Watson was having an incestuous relationship with his sister, which was absolutely false. It seemed like a total smear campaign, and many believed that the police were behind many of the rumors. 5 months after Ben and Olivia had gone missing, in June of 1998, Scott Watson was arrested for their murders. Their bodies had not been found at this point. In fact, they've never been found. Scott's trial wouldn't begin until a year later, and it would last a total of 11 weeks, with more than 500 witnesses called to the stand. The prosecution alleged that Scott Watson had his eyes set on Olivia, so he lured her and Ben onto his boat, the Blade, where he killed them both and then disposed of their bodies before he moved on. You would think this would be a difficult feat, considering the Blade did not match the description of the boat that Olivia and Ben were last seen getting on with that strange man. Yet this is the story that the prosecution gave to the jury. There was another water taxi driver out that night who testified that he had dropped Scott Watson off at his boat, the Blade, sometime between the hours of 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Remember, Ben and Olivia had been dropped off at a yacht with the mystery man in Wallace's water taxi at around 4 a.m. So the timeline is a bit confusing, especially because Scott Watson's timeline was backed up by witnesses who were sleeping on neighboring boats who claimed that they were woken up when Scott returned to the Blade because he was loud, drunk, and he wanted to keep the party going. So we know for sure that Scott was dropped off at the Blade sometime between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Scott Watson claimed he ultimately went to bed after returning to his boat. However, the prosecution alleged that he returned to the shore at some point and then got on the water taxi that was driven by Wallace, where he would meet Ben and Olivia. They weren't able to provide any evidence of this, and there weren't any water taxi drivers who stepped forward to say that they had picked Scott Watson up from the Blade and had taken him back to shore at any point that night. But the prosecution argued that it didn't matter how Scott Watson got back to shore, just that he did. The prosecution also presented the photo lineup as evidence, where water taxi driver Wallace had pointed out the blink photo of Scott Watson, the photo where he had his eyes half closed. They presented this like Wallace had positively identified Scott Watson as the man that he dropped off along with Ben and Olivia. But it should be noted that after the trial was finished, Wallace himself stepped forward to say that he was misled by the police and he believed that Scott Watson was innocent. The way that his eyes were half closed in that specific photo made him look somewhat like the mystery man, but his other features, including his hair, his height, and his stature, they were completely different. There had been another lodge employee who also identified Scott Watson from the blink photo lineup. But she too recanted and even signed an affidavit that stated that she had misidentified him. Other evidence presented at trial included 2 human hairs that were recovered from a blanket aboard Scott Watson's boat. Now, here is where things get a little bit messy. When the blanket was first examined, there were around 400 hairs found on this blanket, mostly short black little hairs. There weren't any hairs identified that looked like Olivia's long blonde hair. However, later in the lab, there would be 2 long blonde hairs found on that blanket. The hair allegedly belonged to Olivia. However, there were serious issues with the way that the hair had been recovered and stored, which could have caused cross-contamination. The defense team argued that Olivia's hair that was actually taken from a brush for testing purposes, it was not kept separate from the hair recovered from the blanket, and that they could have easily been mixed up. They were kept on a table together. It was also learned that there was a 1 centimeter hole found in the evidence bag that contained Olivia's hair, meaning that this hair could have fallen out onto the blanket. Cross-contamination was a real possibility. Other than this alleged hair, there was no other evidence found on Scott Watson's boat that was connected to either Olivia or Ben. And you'd think if they were on this boat, if they had been murdered there would be some evidence. The prosecution also had photos of scratch marks that were found on the foam rubber inside of a hatch on Scott's boat. The photos of these scratches really painted a picture to the jury. One could easily imagine Olivia trying to scratch the hatch in an attempt to break free. It's terrifying to think about, but it's simply not true. The scratch marks were found on portions of the foam that were only accessible when the hatch was opened, not closed. There would be no need to create these scratch marks on the foam in an attempt to get out if the hatch was already open. So the idea that they were caused by Olivia trying to escape, it just didn't make sense. Scott claimed that the scratch marks, they were actually created by his young nieces who were just playing around on his boat. And then we need to talk about the statements given by 2 jailhouse informants. Thankfully, we don't see these kinds of statements holding weight at many trials today because they're extremely problematic. But in 1999, in this trial, the prosecution treated their accounts like they were extremely credible. Both informants testified that they had met Scott Wallace while in prison and that he had told them that he killed Ben Smart and Olivia Hope. Later on, once the trial was over, the first informant recanted his story and admitted that he had lied. At the time that he was approached by investigators in jail for this case, his life was being threatened by other inmates. So he was hoping that by giving a statement, he might get out of prison earlier, saving his life. That's a good reason for him to make this whole thing up. The second informant later admitted that he hardly knew Scott Watson, despite claiming that the two had a deep friendship while on the stand. He also admitted that he was given a car and a cell phone to use once he was released from prison by the police in exchange for this testimony. So basically, we can toss both of their false statements right out of the window. Unfortunately, this bit of information that they had made the whole thing up, it wouldn't be revealed until after the trial was over and a verdict was already made. There were also 3 witnesses called to the stand who had previous interactions with Scott Watson in the years prior to Ben and Olivia's disappearance. These witnesses claimed that Scott Watson was an angry man who had a hatred towards women. According to these 3 individuals, Scott had expressed a desire to kill people in the past, with one witness pointing to an occasion when he had allegedly said he would have killed a woman who had annoyed him at a hotel. This happened about a year before the New Year's Eve incident. The Crown alleged that his past commentary made him the perfect suspect for the murder of a young woman. Do with these statements what you will. At the end of the day, you have the witness statements from those who were on the water taxi with Ben, Olivia, and the mystery man, and their description of the yacht didn't match the description of Scott Watson's boat. Neither does their description of this mystery man, who was described as scruffy-looking with long hair. And both witnesses who picked Scott Watson out of the photo lineup when the Blink photo was presented, Both of them later signed affidavits saying that they did not believe that Scott Watson was the mystery man, that instead they felt pressured and confused by the fact that he had his eyes half closed. Beyond that, you have the hair that the prosecution alleges is Olivia's, which was found on a blanket on Scott's boat. But again, there are issues around the validity of that evidence as well, and whether cross-contamination may have happened. Still, in September 1999, the jury found Scott Wallace guilty of the murders of Ben Smart and Olivia Hope. He was given a life sentence with a minimum 17-year non-parole. Scott maintained his innocence the entire time, and when the guilty verdict was read out loud, he said to the jury, "You're wrong." He has been trying to have his conviction overturned ever since, claiming that he had never even met Ben or Olivia that night at the party. The two never even crossed paths. In April and May of the year 2000, Scott's defense team took his case to the Court of Appeals, but they did not recommend a second trial because there wasn't any new evidence presented. In 2003, his defense team took his case to the Privy Council, but they did not find any grounds for an appeal. In 2009, Scott petitioned the Governor General for a royal pardon, but it was denied. In 2015, Scott was finally up for parole, but his parole is denied after he fails a drug test, and he's deemed a very high risk of committing violent acts if he were to be released from prison. In total, he would be denied parole 4 times for a crime that he says he did not commit. In 2016, Scott Watson had the opportunity to have a sit-down, face-to-face meeting with Gerald Hope, who is Olivia's father. Gerald had expressed concerns over the way the investigation into his daughter's disappearance was handled by police. Gerald has never believed that the full truth of what happened that New Year's Day has ever been revealed. The following year, 2017, a second application for a royal pardon was filed, based on the validity of the 2 hairs that were found on the blanket, believed to have belonged to Olivia. The application was once again rejected. However, in June 2020, Scott Watson's case was once again referred to the Court of Appeals, and again his case centers on the reliability of that hair testing. The grounds for his appeal are as follows. There's the reliability of DNA evidence, specifically hairs that were thought to belong to Hope and recovered from Watson's boat, mistakes by the police in using a photo montage as a means of identifying Watson. The montage contained a new photo that showed Watson caught halfway through a blink. This gave the appearance of hooded eyes, a characteristic of this mystery man's description. His appeal has taken place just this past month during a 5-day hearing. Scott Watson has not asked for a retrial because there isn't any new evidence that's been discovered, and the evidence that was presented at his original trial really should have been tossed out due to possible contamination, those hairs. Also, one of the star witnesses, the water taxi driver, Guy Wallace, he's no longer alive, so he can't even give his statements. He took his life in March 2021, shortly before he was about to stand trial on charges of indecent assault against a teenage girl. Wallace was accused of touching her breasts when she was just 13 years old, putting a vibrator down her top when she was 15, and then once again touching her breasts when she was 15 years old. He denied all of the accusations in his suicide note, and he also wrote about how he felt immense pressure by the police to identify Scott Watson, despite the fact that he did not believe Scott was the man he saw that night taking Ben and Olivia to his boat. Wallace also believed that if he did not point to Scott as the person, the police were going to turn on him and accuse him of being the killer, because they were just that desperate to have the case solved. Scott Watson is now 52 years old, and he has spent half of his life behind bars trying to clear his name. His appeals hearing has now concluded, and now we're just waiting to see whether or not he will die in prison or get a second chance at life. I think the saddest part about this whole situation is that the victims, Ben Smart and Olivia Hope, they have never been found. Their families still have no idea what happened to them. And truthfully, I don't think it's clear who hurt them either. The fast focus on Scott Watson as the sole suspect means that a thorough investigation was never conducted. They focused in on him very quickly, and they only searched him. When he was arrested, there were still hundreds of witnesses who needed to be interviewed. When there were reported sightings of that two-masted ketch with a blue stripe on the hull, those sightings quite literally went ignored when they could have possibly led to a resolution of this case. There were more than 1,500 people at that New Year's Eve party. To say that Scott Watson was the only man with motive and opportunity, it's just simply false because they didn't interview everyone. Unfortunately, the officers in this case seem to have had a gut feeling that Scott Watson was responsible, and then they built their entire case specifically around that theory. They had blinders on, tunnel vision. In 2016, there was a confidential report that was leaked to the New Zealand Herald, written by the Maritime Research Group, and in it seemingly solved the mystery of what happened to Ben Smart and Olivia Hope. It included a distant and grainy photo of a woman who appears to be Olivia, taken 5 days after the investigators alleged that she and Ben were killed by Scott Watson. So this photo, it kind of does look like Olivia, which would mean that she was still alive after New Year's Day, meaning that Scott Watson did in fact not kill her. The report identifies the ketch with the 2 sails and the 3 individuals who are connected to the boat, all of which have lengthy criminal records involving cocaine. According to this report, this ketch was used for drug smuggling. This report and the claims made in it have been ignored by the police, which is unfortunate because there were witnesses who came forward after the duo disappeared with sightings of both Olivia and that boat that she and Ben were alleged to have boarded that night. At this point, it does not seem likely that we will ever know the truth of it all, whether Ben and Olivia are still alive or what really happened to them and who did it. One thing that I do feel strongly about is that Scott Watson did not get a fair trial. Investigators had tunnel vision very early on, and sadly, that comes at the expense of the truth. I'll be following this story closely as we wait to hear whether or not Scott will have his conviction overturned. In the meantime, I'd love to hear what you think. Do you believe that Scott Watson is connected to the disappearance of Ben Smart and Olivia Hope? Or what really happened here? Did he get a fair trial? Let me know what you think. That's it for me tonight. If you want to reach out, you can find me on Facebook at Serial Napper. I also have a Serial Napper true crime discussion group. It's called Serial Society, and I'll have the link in my show notes. I'd love to chat with you about this case and all of the other cases that I cover, plus anything else going on in true crime. You can find my audio on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you listen to podcasts. I post all of my episodes in video format over on YouTube, so go check it out. And if you're watching on YouTube, I would love if you can give me a thumbs up and subscribe because every little bit helps. I'm over on X, formerly known as Twitter, at serial_napper, and I post things on TikTok at serialnappernick, and that's all one word. Until next time, sweet dreams, stay kind, especially in the comments. Bye.